My name is Madeline. I'm 32 years old and used to be a financial analyst living in Philadelphia. On my birthday, before I could even set the cake down on the table, my mother shoved a packed bag into my hands and my father coldly muttered, "You should move out. The sooner, the better." No birthday wishes, no goodbye hug. Just rejection from the very people I once believed were my family. I once paid off the entire mortgage just to keep that house. The electric bills, roof repairs, my mother's medications, every cost was silently carried by me. But in the end, I was nothing more than a walking wallet. Have you ever been treated like a burden by your own family, even though you were the only one keeping them afloat? Leave a comment below if you've ever felt betrayed by the people closest to you. Hit like if you believe kindness should never be treated as an obligation. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happened after I walked out of that house will keep you hooked. At 22, when my peers were juggling part-time jobs and weekend parties, I had already entered the relentless cycle of family responsibility. I was the only one in the household with a steady job, a financial analyst position at a small investment firm in Philadelphia. On the day I received my first paycheck, I didn't use it to buy the winter coat I'd loved since college. I used it to pay off 3 months of overdue electric bills for my parents. Frank, my father, used to work as a maintenance technician at a machine shop. But after getting fired for chronic absenteeism and being caught gambling during work hours, he never held a job again. I don't think he even tried. He spent his days glued to the TV, beer in hand, constantly grumbling about government theft and those damned bosses. Linda, my mother, was once capable, or at least I believed she was when I was a child. But everything changed after Grandpa died. The life insurance payout of over $40,000 could have cleared the mortgage and eased our lives. Instead, she used it as a down payment on a brand new SUV, then splurged on luxury furniture for the living room. Honey, our family deserves to look good too, she beamed while I stared in disbelief at the receipt. When I asked where the rest of the money went, she shrugged. Bought Ethan some stuff for school. The youngest deserves a better shot than his sister, right? Ethan, my younger brother, was 15 at the time. He didn't say a word. Just looked down at his brand new iPhone, which I hadn't even known she'd bought using that money. I still remember her offhand remark, "You've got a job now, you don't need any of this." From then on, I practically carried the entire family's expenses. The electric, water, and internet bills were all under my name. When Frank developed a foot infection from diabetes but had no insurance, I was the one who paid for everything. I remember draining my entire savings account that day, including the portion I'd set aside for an evening MBA course. I lied to my boss saying my mother was ill just to take 2 days off. In reality, I ran between the hospital and pharmacies, then back home to soak a warm towel and clean his foot while he lay on the couch, complaining that the hospital nurses were too slow. The worst came during the winter of my 26th year. A snowstorm had ripped part of the back roof off and water was dripping right into the kitchen. Frank didn't even get up from his recliner. Linda sighed, "Guess we'll have to call someone to fix it." But we had no money. I asked, "Where's that payment coming from?" She didn't respond. Ethan just shrugged, "You'll figure it out, you're the finance expert, right?" I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, but because the fury was lodged in my throat. That night, I went to my room, opened my laptop, and canceled the New Year's trip I had planned with my college friends all year. I took that money, hired a roofer, and spent my weekend on top of the house, helping remove rotted boards. The cold stiffened my fingers, the wind burned like razors across my skin. But I stayed up there because no one else would. When the workers left, Linda stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, glanced at me and said, "You should put on a hat, you'll catch a cold." Then she walked back inside without a single thank you. This cycle repeated so often I lost count. Ethan's old car broke down. I paid for the tow-in repairs. Linda needed supplements for women's health that insurance wouldn't cover. I paid. Frank got his license suspended for unpaid traffic tickets. I paid the fines. Everyone in that house assumed I would always show up, always figure it out, always fix everything. And if I showed any sign of exhaustion, Linda would rest a hand on my shoulder and say, "Don't do good and expect praise, dear." Every time she said that, I didn't know whether to feel grateful or gutted. Honestly, I used to believe that if I kept sacrificing, kept being patient, one day they would change. That they'd realize how much I mattered. That they'd appreciate me. But that day never came. I never had a real corner of my own in that house. My bedroom barely fit a single bed, a rickety desk, and a DIY closet. I once wanted to repaint the walls, but Linda said, "Why bother? It's just temporary." Temporary. 10 years of being temporary. That's what my existence was in a house I'd kept from falling apart. I wasn't allowed to bring friends over because Frank didn't want outsiders seeing him in that state. I wasn't allowed to talk about work because Linda insisted, talking about money all the time gives me a headache. I wasn't allowed to fail because if I missed sending money even once, I'd get a message, "Don't forget this house still needs to survive." I often wondered, if I disappeared, would anyone actually worry about me? Or just worry about who'd pay the bills? That question never left me, especially after that day, when they handed me a suitcase on my 32nd birthday and gently said, "You should go." As if I hadn't been the lifeline keeping that roof above their heads for the past decade. That night, as I sat alone in that cramped temporary room, I started opening old bills, overlooked documents, and forgotten email threads. That's when I found something no one in my family ever expected. A detail that would shift everything. But before I tell you that, we need to go back to a contract buried deep in an old drawer signed 3 years ago, under a name they never imagined would be mine. I didn't sleep in my room that night. Technically, I no longer had one. They'd locked the door as if cutting me off completely. I wandered around the backyard, eventually curling up on a folding chair in the garage, my childhood hideout when the family argued. The air reeked of oil and rotting wood, but at least it had a roof. Wrapped in a heavy coat, phone battery at 12%, I opened my inbox, looking for anything to keep me awake. Or at least distract me from the fact I'd just been thrown out on my birthday. Scrolling past work emails, junk mail, billing notices, my eyes landed on a flagged subject from 3 years ago. Memorandum of Deed Transfer, 12/15. I opened it, heart pounding. The scanned document appeared on screen, the typed lines sharp and clear. It was a memorandum from the bank's lawyer, confirming that full ownership of the house at 1449 was transferred to me, Madeline Marie Carter, as part of a debt restructuring agreement after Frank Carter defaulted on his mortgage. I remembered that time clearly. Frank had spiraled into gambling debt and the bank threatened foreclosure. Linda panicked. Ethan was starting senior year and I used up 70% of my savings and took out a personal loan to save the collapsing house. I even took a 3-month leave from work to handle the paperwork, refinance the loan, and assume the title. But after that, no one mentioned it. Not once. As if it never happened. I didn't bring it up either. I figured keeping the house intact was enough. I convinced myself of that. And they were content letting me believe it. But now, alone in the freezing garage, the glow of the phone screen lighting my pale face, I read the words again. Property title. Madeline Marie Carter. Fully transferred upon settlement of principal and restructuring fee for loan #0147-67BN per contract dated December 15th. I was the legal owner of that house. Not Frank. Not Linda. Me. I had forgotten, or more accurately, I never thought to use that fact against them. I had seen it merely as a necessary step to preserve stability. But now, after they pushed me out without a single thank you, without even a decent glance, that truth wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was an opportunity. Not for revenge, but to reclaim the fairness I never had. I pulled up the old email from the law office, the one that handled the transfer. Her name was Marla Jensen, a middle-aged woman I met just once during that winter. I had helped her untangle a complicated tax filing case back when I worked at the investment firm. We stayed in touch like two women who both knew the law, when used right, could be a quiet but deadly weapon. I sent her a short email. Marla, I need confirmation on the legal status of the property at 1449 Maple Street. Call me anytime tomorrow morning. This is urgent. Less than 10 minutes later, she replied. I still have the original file. The house is in your name, no disputes. Call me in the morning and I'll prepare any documents you might need. I let out a long breath. My chest felt lighter, but at the same time my mind sharpened, not with fear but with clarity. I thought about how they would react if they found out they were living off the grace of someone they'd just kicked out. Frank would lose his mind. Linda would cry and play the victim. Ethan would post some dramatic nonsense online. But I knew I couldn't give in. I had lived too long as the reasonable, understanding, mature daughter. I had let them define whether I mattered in that house for far too long. I shut off my phone, folded my arms, tucked them between my knees, and sat curled up under a thin blanket. Outside, the wind rattled the garage door with a bone-deep howl. I didn't sleep. I just sat there staring into the dark, knowing that from this moment forward, everything would change. They kicked me out like I was some parasite. But they had no idea. I was the one holding the keys to that house. Literally and legally. I remembered that conversation 3 years ago when the bank's lawyer asked me, "Are you sure you want the full ownership? This would mean your family no longer has any claim to the property." I said, "As long as they have a place to live, I don't need anyone to know." She shook her head but processed it anyway. Maybe she too had once been someone's daughter who believed love alone could earn her love in return. But now I understood. Sacrifice doesn't guarantee recognition. Especially in a family where people are used to assuming you'll always be there, but never bother to ask if you're okay. I pulled my coat tighter, heart hollow but eyes wide open. I knew exactly what I had to do. Not out of spite, but to remind them and myself that I was no longer the shadow behind their lives. I was the one who kept that roof over their heads. And now I was the one who would decide who got to stay under it. I left the house the next morning, dragging my small suitcase behind me across the front lawn. The early morning wind slipped past my collar, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew Frank was probably still snoring in his room, and Linda was likely sipping coffee wrapped in a blanket, eyes glued to the morning news on TV. The only difference was, they had no idea that sunrise marked the moment I began pulling away from their lives, one quiet but irreversible step at a time. I went to Tessa's apartment, my college best friend. She lived alone in a small unit near Kensington, Philadelphia. Tessa opened the door with a worried face and wrapped me in a hug without asking a single question. I sat on her couch, hands still trembling, not just from the cold. I told her everything, no edits, no filters. My voice was low and even, like I was hearing the story from someone else. "You've carried too much for too long," Tessa said when I finished. "It's time." I nodded. I couldn't even cry anymore. The pain had been replaced with something cold, sharp, and focused. I opened my laptop, logged into all the accounts I had managed for them for years. Every click felt like cutting a thread that had slowly bled me dry. I started with electricity. The account had been in my name since I was 23. After Frank missed 3 consecutive payments and we were almost cut off during the winter. I canceled the autopay. The screen displayed the confirmation with a final service date, October 31st. After that, no more lights when Linda flipped the switch in the living room. Next was water. The city utility portal had an outdated interface, but I knew every step by heart. I logged in, deleted the debit card information, and hit confirm. When it asked for a reason, I selected moving, no longer residing at this address. Then came the internet. I'd set it up under my name when I began working remotely after the pandemic. I remembered how Frank used to scoff, "A job where you don't need pants isn't a real job." But he ended up being the one who used it the most, for YouTube sports fake news. I logged into the account, selected terminate service. A notice popped up. Access will be disabled within 24 hours of confirmation. I didn't hesitate. Each action carried its own weight, like pulling bricks from a wall that had kept me caged. But one task made me pause: the joint bank account with Linda. I never quite understood why I agreed to it. Maybe because she always said, "in case something happens." Maybe because I still wanted to believe I was part of that family. But in truth, it had become her gateway to borrowing. A few hundred here for supplements, a few hundred there for Ethan's tuition, then Frank's car, or a new fridge. None of it ever came back. I transferred the remaining balance, just over $400, into my personal account. Then I went into the settings, removed all access, deleted my name from the account entirely. Then I closed it. Finally, I opened the assets folder on my hard drive, the one where I stored the deed transfer from 3 years ago. I printed out a copy along with the notarized certificate and drafted a letter to the address I once called home. To Frank and Linda Carter. According to the legally binding deed transfer dated December 15, 20XX, I, Madeline Marie Carter, am the sole and lawful owner of the property located at 1449 Maple Street. Due to continued non-cooperation and inappropriate behavior from the current occupants at the above address, I formally request that you vacate the property within 30 days of receiving this notice. Please direct any communication or response to my legal representative, Marla Jensen, the original handling attorney for this property. I printed 2 copies. One went by certified mail. The other I emailed directly to Marla with a note, ready to proceed with repossession if necessary. Tessa stood behind me holding 2 mugs of hot tea, silently watching. When I returned to the table, she said softly, "I can't believe you carried all of this on your own for so long." I took the cup, letting its warmth seep into my hands. "I don't know either," I replied. "Probably too long." We didn't say anything else. On the screen, the cancellation confirmations still glowed bright. I took screenshots of everything and saved them in a folder I named Reclaiming. Not revenge, not reclaiming territory, just a quiet journey to take back the parts of life I'd lost in silence. I double-checked everything. The list was clear. Electricity, cancelled water, cancelled internet, cancelled cable TV, cancelled joint account, closed property ownership, verified eviction letter, sent. Everything had been carefully undone. Each action was like a clean slice through the invisible ropes that had kept me tied to that old draining cycle. I took a sip of tea. It was bitter. But the kind of bitterness that felt grounding, not like the kind my mother used to lecture about. Sacrifice for your family is always a bitter medicine. Oh. This bitterness was clarity. The taste of someone finally saying, "That's enough." I reopened Marla's email and added a line. "I don't want them to suffer. But I do need them to leave. No drama, no force, just leave. They told me I had no place in that house. I'm simply honoring their request." A minute later she responded. "Understood. I'll make sure everything is legal and by the book. They won't have grounds to blame you." I nodded to myself, then leaned back into the chair, letting the warmth from the tea spread through my body. I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything. Not Frank. Not Linda. Not even Ethan. I was simply reclaiming what I had paid for with a decade of my youth. And I would do it without needing anyone's approval. I'd stopped searching for recognition in a household where gratitude only ever flowed one way. The first call came the next afternoon while I was helping Tessa clean the kitchen. My phone buzzed across the counter with a rhythm I knew too well. "Mom" flashed on the screen next to a heart emoji I had set years ago. A small gesture from when I still believed love could bridge any distance. I let it ring 3 times, then it stopped, only to ring again. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to hear her voice. But by the 5th call I knew she wouldn't stop. I stepped out onto the balcony, clutching the phone tightly, and finally pressed accept. "Hello," I said, my voice low and flat. On the other end, there was only the sound of shallow breathing at first, then a small sob. "Madeline, your father. His blood pressure spiked this morning. The doctor said we need to monitor him closely. Do you really want to kill your father over a house?" I didn't respond immediately. I leaned my shoulder against the cold iron railing, looking down at the slow-moving traffic bathed in golden afternoon light. "Are you talking about the man who kicked me out on my birthday?" I asked calmly. "The one who had no issue throwing me out at night with nowhere to sleep?" Linda fell silent. A pause stretched long between us. Then her voice cracked into a cry. "That's not what I meant, you know that. We were just stressed. And then you blew everything out of proportion. You shut off the power, the water, the internet, you closed the bank account. You've turned the whole house upside down." I pressed my lips together. "I only turned off the things I've been paying for the past 10 years, Mom. If the house feels upside down now, maybe it's because you all got too comfortable relying on me without realizing it. I'm old now, Madeline. I can't start over like you. And your father, you know his heart condition." I sighed. "And when you both called me a freeloader and threw me out, did either of you think about where I'd go? Did anyone care that I was the one who paid your hospital bill when you had that blood infection and no insurance? Or when I skipped Christmas that year to work extra shifts just to pay for Dad's medication?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. But I couldn't hear sincerity anymore. I hung up before she could say anything else. Not long after, I got a message from Ethan. No greeting. No checking in. Just one short, cold paragraph. "You selfish bitch. Living off our parents all your life, now stealing their house. You made Mom cry all night, Dad nearly had a stroke. I hope you're proud of yourself for tearing this family apart." I read the message once. Then again. My eyes didn't blink. Then. The brother I used to drive to school, the one I bought a car for, the one I changed his oil every winter. I remembered the night before his high school finals. I stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning helping him study, then got up early the next day to go to work so I wouldn't lose hours on my paycheck. I didn't respond. I opened the reclaiming folder, created a new subfolder called Messages. I copied that message and saved it alongside old receipts and legal documents. I'm not the kind of person who holds grudges. But I've learned that proof is the one thing that can't be twisted, can't be erased by tears or manipulation. That evening, Frank posted on Facebook. I wasn't connected with him, but an old classmate sent me a screenshot. It was a public post, short and bitter. Not all children are grateful. Some grow up to be selfish, heartless. They take your home, your peace in your old age and call it a victory. May God guide them. More than 100 reactions. A few distant relatives commented, "So sorry, stay strong Mr. and Mrs. Carter, kids these days have no soul." But there were some familiar names too. People who had seen me work triple shifts to pay for Frank's insulin when he had diabetes complications. They didn't comment. Some just left a emoji, some said nothing at all. I didn't feel angry. Just sad. Sad they didn't remember. Or maybe they never really paid attention. Tessa sat next to me watching the screen go quiet. "Do you want me to respond?" she asked. I shook my head. "No need. They're trying to rewrite the story. But I'm keeping the truth." She nodded, then handed me a hot cup of tea. Peppermint. My favorite since college. I held it, hands slightly trembling but steadier than before. I used to believe that if I just kept giving, they'd eventually see what I did for them. But it turns out when people get used to being fed, they forget what effort tastes like. Now that they no longer have someone to serve them, I'm no longer the kind daughter. I'm the traitor, the selfish whore, the ungrateful one. All because I chose to rise and step out from under their shadow. I took a sip of tea, then opened my laptop to continue working with Marla's assistant on finalizing the home reclamation paperwork. Not out of revenge, but because I couldn't let them continue living in the house I saved, only to turn around and spit on my kindness like that. I used to be their daughter. But now I'm just myself. And I'm starting to learn how to live without the apology I know will never come. 3 days after Frank's Facebook post, I received a thick gold-edged envelope with a red seal from the Philadelphia County Court. The mail carrier handed it directly to Tessa, along with a sympathetic look. I was washing dishes in the kitchen when I heard her call. "Madeline, letter from the court." I dried my hands and walked to the living room. When I picked up the envelope, it felt like touching a block of ice. On the front, in bold, "Notice of lawsuit, summons." I opened it slowly, the crisp paper sounding like thin blades slicing through skin. Inside were the accusations: property theft, elder abuse, abandonment of dependent relatives. Plaintiffs: Frank Carter and Linda Carter. Defendant: Madeline Marie Carter, biological daughter. I read each line, my eyes stretching to the limit. They wrote that I had secretly used financial tactics to transfer home ownership, that I intentionally left the parents without power, water, or communication, that I used my former job position to manipulate payments and push relatives into vulnerability. Tessa sat beside me reading along. When she got to the bottom where the attorney's name was signed, Matthew Klein Askew, her face paled. "That name sounds familiar," she murmured. Then she walked into her small office and returned less than 5 minutes later with a printed email from last month. On the paper was a retainer invoice for legal services, over $2,000, paid through a Discover card, a secondary card under the name Linda Carter, account number matching the very credit card I had opened for my mother nearly 8 years ago. I remembered that afternoon clearly. Linda needed money for supplements her nutritionist recommended. I opened a secondary card under my name since she didn't have enough credit. I set a monthly limit of $800 and reminded her again and again to only use it in emergencies. I never imagined that 8 years later they would use that very card to sue me. I sat frozen on the sofa, heart tangled. Not because I feared losing, but because the shock pierced so deep. My family, the ones I supported through winters with no heat, the hospital bills, the car repairs, the groceries paid with overtime hours, were now using the very money I gave them to throw legal daggers back at me. I didn't cry. I wasn't even angry. I just felt empty. The kind of empty you feel waking up from a long dream, only to realize you've been walking the wrong path your whole life. Tessa placed a hand on my shoulder. You need to respond. Fast and clearly. I nodded. Then I opened my laptop. Logged into the bank system, found the Discover credit card and clicked Permanently Freeze Card. The system asked for a reason. I selected Unauthorized Use, Abusive Access. I continued accessing all linked accounts, the ones I had once left flexible for them to use in case of emergencies. I shut them all down. Joint savings. Instant transfer accounts. Even the shared Amazon Prime account I used with my mom to buy household essentials. Each click sliced clean through the invisible cords tying me to them. Then I called Marla. Her voice was as calm and steady as the day we first met. I just received the case file, I said. They're suing me. I figured, she replied. I started prepping the moment you sent the home recall request. I told her everything. The secondary card, the invoices, how they were using the money I had provided to pay for their attorney. She didn't interrupt, only nodded occasionally through the phone. We'll file a counterclaim, she said after I finished. I'll draft a full rebuttal to every charge. But Madeline, you'll need to be ready to show up. They're not going to back down. I'm not backing down anymore, I replied. I never wanted to start this. But I'm ready to end it. Marla asked me to send all documentation. Utility bills, credit card statements, payment confirmations, home repair receipts, bank statements, and a copy of the property transfer contract. It took me nearly 5 hours to organize everything. From faded 5-year-old invoices to the email I sent Frank asking why the gas bill had spiked during spring 2019. I didn't skip a single detail. Every piece of paper was a memory, a sacrifice, a moment of endurance, a hope that had gone unanswered. Tessa printed everything, sorted by date, and placed them in labeled folders. When we finished, the entire kitchen table was buried in documents. I looked at the stack, nearly a hand's width tall, and felt a tightness in my chest. If anyone asks, I whispered, this is the answer. Tessa looked at me with a mix of empathy and admiration. Not everyone can turn pain into legal paperwork. I didn't respond. I only knew that if they wanted to drag me into court as a traitor, I would walk in as someone with evidence. I wouldn't scream, beg, or cry for fairness. I would lay out each page, each figure, each undeniable proof, and let the truth speak for itself. 6 weeks after I received the lawsuit, the county court issued its final ruling. The notice was sent to Marla Jensen's office, its language brutally clear. Plaintiffs Frank and Linda Carter must vacate the property at 1449 Maple Street within 60 days from the date the order was signed. The house, based on documentation, financial records, and witness statements, was legally under my name, the sole payer of property taxes, utilities, and maintenance for the past 5 consecutive years. Marla read the full notice aloud to me over the phone, her voice flat but gentle. I sat silently in Tessa's living room, the tea in my hand long gone cold. At my feet, sunlight spilled through the window, breaking my shadow into shards across the hardwood floor. Do you want someone to reclaim the property this week? Marla asked. I shook my head before realizing she couldn't see me. No. Wait until the last day. I don't need to rush the win. I hung up. Tessa stepped out of the kitchen and handed me a warm muffin. She didn't say anything, just set it on a plate and sat beside me. We stayed like that for a long while, not speaking. Outside, the season had turned. The wind slid across the awning, rustling a few dry maple leaves along the porch. On the 60th day, Marla and a local enforcement officer arrived at the Maple Street house. I didn't go. I didn't want to stand there and watch Frank and Linda pack their final belongings with resentment in their eyes. I didn't need to see them to know their hearts were breaking. Not from losing a house, but from losing someone to lean on. Marla called me once it was done. They left at 10 in the morning. It was fairly quiet. Frank raised his voice a bit, but the officer kept things orderly. I'll have the keys returned by tomorrow. I sat there, remembering all the winters I stayed up guarding the fireplace when the central heater broke. All the times I used my paycheck to change light bulbs, repair the rotten shed door. All the nights I sat alone filling out their tax returns to avoid late penalties. No one knew, or maybe no one ever really paid attention. But what I never expected was the reaction from others. 3 days later, I walked past the small grocery store near the old house. The owner, Mrs. Marjorie, who used to sell me discounted vegetables every weekend, stood behind the register. When she looked up and saw me, I expected suspicion or coldness. Instead, she smiled softly. A sad smile, but one of understanding. "I heard about everything," she said, her eyes never leaving the newspaper open in front of her. "In the end, the one who held that house together was you. Not Frank. Not Linda." I froze for a moment. Her words felt like wind slipping through an old doorframe, shaking loose everything I'd tried to bury. "I just did what I could," I replied. "And you did more than anyone in this neighborhood ever imagined," she nodded. I thanked her and stepped out of the shop. But that afternoon, her words lingered in my mind like dust caught in the light. As if some part of me still couldn't believe anyone might actually see the truth I'd been screaming in silence for a decade. The next day, I got a message from Marla. The house had been sealed due to unpaid property taxes for the current year. Technically, I was still responsible for them, but ever since I was forced out of the house, I'd requested the local government pause all payments made on behalf of the owner. The amount wasn't large, but it was enough to justify a legal property seal if no one paid it on time. That same afternoon, I walked up to the house. It was eerily quiet. The grass in the front yard had grown up to my ankles. Dry leaves covered the steps. The wooden welcome sign hung crooked by the front door. A crimson notice was pasted on the window frame. "Property sealed. City of Philadelphia. Do not enter." I stood at the curb, staring at the house that once held all my loyalty, that I had sacrificed personal relationships to protect from collapse. And now it was empty. Inside and out. A neighbor, Mr. Ben, who lived 2 houses down, rode by on his bike. When he saw me, he stopped, pushed his worn baseball cap up on his forehead and said, "I knew it wasn't as simple as what Frank was telling everyone." I looked at him, saying nothing. "You shoveled the snow on this whole block when you were 23. I remember because I was in a wheelchair after hip surgery. You didn't say a word, just did it, then quietly went back inside." He paused, then said slowly, "You've never been the villain in this." I felt a lump in my throat. After that, more stories trickled in. An elderly woman on the corner told Tessa that Linda used to brag about having a daughter who was a chief financial officer but stingy, all while accepting grocery deliveries I paid for weekly. A postal worker recalled seeing me bring property tax bills into the post office to pay on my parents' behalf, year after year. Bit by bit, the cracks in the false story began to show. No drama. No spectacle. Just the truth, seeping through quietly, and no one wanted to get their hands wet in it anymore. The Maple Street house slowly became a symbol of something broken, something that had passed. But I was still here. Still breathing. And I owed no one anything. I didn't speak up right away. After Frank and Linda were ordered out of the house, I lived quietly in a small rental apartment near West Kensington. Every morning I made coffee, tidied up a bit, then scrolled through hundreds of unread emails, mostly ads or reminders from the bank. But one night, after closing my laptop, I picked up my phone and mindlessly opened a local women's group, an online space where people shared daily life tips, recipes, and sometimes raw confessions that hit like a punch. I don't know what compelled me. Maybe it was the soft golden glow from the nightstand lamp, or maybe it was Tessa's quiet voice from the next room, warm and steady. I suddenly felt the need to tell my story, not to justify but to release it once and for all. I wrote. Not long-winded. No embellishment. Just the truth. I said I'd been my family's financial anchor for 10 years. That I was kicked out on my birthday. That they sued me, then were legally removed from the house that had always been in my name, the same house I once saved from foreclosure. I didn't mention names. Didn't give legal details. I simply described what it felt like to be caught between loyalty and loneliness, kindness and the last thread of self-respect. At the end I wrote, "I don't know if I did everything right. But if you've ever felt hurt by the very family you tried to protect, I hope you know, you're not alone." I hit post just before 2 a.m. Then turned off my phone. I didn't expect much. I just felt a little lighter. The next morning my phone buzzed nonstop. I opened it and was stunned. More than 800 likes. Over 200 comments. Strangers calling me by name in private messages. Anonymous users sharing their own stories. Moms who took their children's savings, fathers who forced them to quit jobs to care for siblings, cousins who branded them ungrateful for stopping the monthly support. An older woman named Angela wrote, "I'm 70 now and only recently admitted that my daughter wasn't the only selfish one in our mother-daughter relationship." A user named June Lover shared, "My sister took my inheritance because my parents thought she was more fragile. I stayed quiet for 10 years. Today I realized I wasn't crazy." Story after story poured in like a broken dam. Women of all ages from all across the country started speaking the unspeakable. Some had been silent their whole lives. Some had just decided to move out of their parents' house after 30 years of living in fear. Tessa looked at me not with surprise anymore but with something deeper. A kind of reverence. "You just did something huge, Madeline," she said. "Not everyone can turn personal pain into a mirror for others to see themselves." I wasn't sure if I'd done anything huge. I just knew that I didn't feel ashamed for walking away. 3 days later, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from a woman named Claire Hudson, the coordinator for a nightly talk segment on WPRD 104.7, a local station focused on social issues, mental health, and the lives of middle-aged women. "Dear Madeline, I'm Claire, program director for Quiet Between the Cracks. One of our contributors came across your post and sent it to me. We believe your story would truly resonate with our audience. We'd love to invite you to speak on air, to share your experience and explore the theme you've touched so compassionately: toxic families and the manipulation of empathy." I read the email again and again. Tessa sat across from me waiting for my reaction. I was quiet for a long moment, then looked up and asked, "Do you think I should do it?" She smiled. "You're not just telling your story anymore. You're giving voice to the ones who still can't speak." The segment was scheduled for Thursday night live at 8 p.m. Claire called me beforehand to chat, guide me, and reassure me with her calm, warm voice. "No pressure, Madeline. Just be yourself." When the studio light blinked on, I sat before the microphone, headphones over my ears, listening to the soft opening theme. Claire introduced me with a single sentence. "Tonight, we'll hear from a woman who went from silence to voice, not for revenge but for rebirth." I began to speak. At first my voice trembled a little, but it steadied as I shared my story. I talked about working since I was 22. About paying bills, fixing roofs, buying a car for my brother. About being called a burden when I had nothing left to give. I spoke about my 32nd birthday, the day I was handed my suitcase and told to leave with no one even saying, "Happy birthday." I spoke without hesitation, without fear. Claire didn't interrupt. She simply nodded and occasionally offered soft, reassuring words. "I understand. I see. They didn't see your worth, but you did." When the program ended, I thought maybe only a few people had tuned in. But then my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in, from women in my neighborhood, from an old friend in Ohio, even from a high school history teacher who simply wrote, "I'm proud of you, Madeline. You stayed true to yourself." The community didn't just stand with me. They stepped forward, stood beside me, and continued the story, and that was what moved me most. No one had to stay quiet anymore. No one had to live with nameless wounds anymore. And for the first time in a long while, I no longer felt alone when I said the word family. Once all the legal matters were settled, once Frank and Linda were no longer in the Maple Street house, I returned there with a heart no longer gripped by fear. The house appeared under the pale light of late afternoon, its roof darkened by time, the wooden door chipped and peeling, the white fence flecked with moss. But this time I didn't look at it with the eyes of a child asking permission to step inside. I looked at it as the owner, and more than that, as someone who now had the power to decide what to do with it. I didn't want to stay. Not because I didn't have the right, but because I understood that every wall held memories soaked into its very mortar. And the memories here were too heavy for me to sleep beneath this roof. I called Tessa as I stood in the dusty living room. "I want to turn this place into a temporary shelter," I said. "For women like the one I used to be, those manipulated financially, emotionally by families who made them forget they had a right to live differently." Tessa didn't hesitate. "I'll help you." We started planning. I reached out to a small nonprofit that supported survivors of marital abuse and family coercion. The director, Helen Murphy, a silver-haired woman who spoke slowly but whose eyes shone like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds, visited the house one Saturday morning. She walked through each room, a small notebook in hand. "This house has a particular kind of quiet," she said, stopping at the kitchen window. as if it's been through so much but it's still standing. I smiled softly. It's a lot like the person who used to live here. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Then it'll be the perfect place to start over. The renovations took nearly 4 months. We didn't strip the house of its past. We kept the wooden frames, only replacing what had rotted, repainting the walls in soft creams and gentle grays. The living room became a shared space filled with bookshelves, a standing lamp, and a few warm armchairs. The upstairs bedrooms were reconfigured to hold 4 individual beds, each with its own lock, a small dresser, and a window that let in morning light. The kitchen was upgraded with natural wood counters, a water purifier, and a long table that could seat 8, because I believed meals were when people in pain could begin to laugh again. We named the house the Quiet Porch, a place where those who stepped in didn't have to speak unless they wanted to. A place where they could just be, just breathe, just exist without fear. When the house officially opened in October, fall had painted every tree in deep reds and golds. The backyard, where I once stood weeping after being unfairly scolded by Linda, where I had repaired a broken water line so they could shower in winter, now rang with the laughter of children, 2 little ones belonging to a young woman named Maria, who had fled her husband with only a suitcase and 2 tiny pairs of shoes. She sat on the porch each evening watching her children play in the yard and then turned to me with a smile. I don't know why I feel safe here, but I sleep without dreaming of being thrown out. I didn't reply. I just reached for her hand, wanting to pass along something that didn't need to be said aloud. One afternoon in November, while I was checking supplies in the back storage room, Tessa walked in holding a slim beige envelope. "You've got a letter. No return address, but it's postmarked from Boston." I took it, immediately recognizing the handwriting before I even opened it. Inside was a card. A baby naming invitation from Ethan Carter and his wife Rebecca. At the bottom it read, "We know you don't want to stay in contact, but we hope you'll know our son's name is Micah, which means, who is like God?" And I chose it to remind myself that being a father is not a right, but a responsibility. I sat on the back steps, gripping the card. In the distance, the sound of falling leaves whispered like secrets carried on the breeze. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just felt something soften in my chest, like a layer of frost finally melting under late autumn sun. That evening I wrote a reply. Not long. Not judgmental. Just one line: "I forgive but I don't forget. Family is a choice, not a burden." I sealed the envelope, left it on the table, and in that moment, I knew I no longer carried the invisible weight I'd borne for so long. The Maple Street house, once my silent prison, now glowed each evening. There was laughter, the smell of baked goods, the sound of a radio playing classical music mixed with the babble of young voices. But above all, there was peace. Not the forced kind, but the kind that comes when you no longer have to strain to be accepted. I didn't live there, but I visited every week. I refreshed the flowers in the living room, cleaned the second-floor windows, and sometimes just sat quietly on the porch, watching people walk in with eyes full of hope. And I knew I had finally turned the house into a true home, not built by blood but by deliberate kindness. That night, when everyone inside the Maple Street house had drifted to sleep, I stood alone at the second-floor window. The street lamps cast a soft amber glow over the patchy brick sidewalks. Far off, lights flicked on across the neighborhood like signs of life blinking into the early night. A gentle November wind slipped through the cracks of the window frame, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth after the season's first rain. I placed my hand against the glass, feeling the thin layer of condensation form beneath my fingers. Everything outside looked the same, but I was not the same person anymore. Inside me, a question echoed, not in anger this time. How does a daughter become the enemy in the very house she once protected with all her heart? I no longer sought the answer. I just knew this. Some ties are born in blood but not maintained in love. And sometimes, you have to accept the cruelest truth in order to finally begin living your own life. That not everyone who gave you life will choose to love you well. I used to believe family was unchangeable. That if I tried hard enough, long enough, if I was patient and agreeable, then maybe someday Frank would call me his wonderful daughter like he had when I was 8. That Linda would embrace me and say I did the right thing instead of scolding me with that tired phrase, "Don't expect praise for doing your duty." But none of that ever came. And finally, I learned that sometimes, in order to find yourself, you have to let go of the people you once believed would always stay. I wonder if someone out there is listening to this story and feels that same tug in their chest. Maybe you're in the middle of a similar journey. Maybe you're still the one holding everything together with the last bit of strength you have. Maybe you're still sending money, still making calls home, still swallowing the deepest wounds from the very people who once taught you the word family. I'm not saying you have to walk away right now. I'm not telling you that forgiveness is weakness or that strength means cutting people off. I just want you to know that protecting yourself doesn't make you a bad person. There will be people who call you selfish just because you stop obeying. There will be people who paint you as a traitor just because you dared to say, "I can't take this anymore." And there will be people who turn their backs, deny you, manipulate you, just to keep their power in a family structure that's long worn out. But no one, absolutely no one, has the right to make you feel worthless simply because you choose to live in line with your own conscience. It took me 10 years to learn that. 10 years paid for with tears, with sleepless nights worrying about debt, with silent dinners where I swallowed not just cold food but unspoken bitterness. And now, as I look out over the peaceful neighborhood bathed in warm yellow light, I'm grateful for myself. I'm grateful for the woman who chose not to stay silent. I'm grateful for the young girl who stood up in that freezing garage and chose to act, even with trembling hands. And I'm grateful for everyone who, in their own quiet way, stepped out of the cycle of endurance without needing applause. The community might not always understand you. Family may never admit they were wrong. But you don't need anyone's approval to prove your worth. That worth is in every decision you make, every boundary you draw, every time you place your hand on your heart and say, "I deserve peace." Think about Ethan. About the letter he sent. About the look in his eyes the day he came to find me at the center. Not to apologize but to understand. I saw in his eyes the fear of a man about to become a father, afraid of repeating old mistakes. And I forgave, not for him but for myself because I no longer wanted to carry that anger inside me. I think about the women who passed through the quiet porch. Maria, who landed her first job after 8 years at home taking care of her husband. Janet, who had forgotten her own bank account number after 15 years of using only her husband's cards. Olivia, the oldest, 72 when she arrived, her voice shaking as she said, "I thought it was too late. But turns out as long as you're alive, you still have the right to choose again." I learned more from them than from any book or lecture. I learned that sometimes what you need most isn't to escape a house. It's to escape the idea that you owe it your loyalty just to prove you're a good daughter. I learned that a house doesn't make a family. It's kindness and the choice to stay for each other that does. I stood up, closed the curtains, turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. Every footstep echoed on the old wooden floor like a reminder that I was walking a new life, no longer driven by anyone else's expectations, but by my own clarity. If you're still listening and if any part of this story feels like yours, then I hope you'll dare to ask yourself one thing. Who am I living for? And am I still myself in that house? And if the answer is no, then I hope you know, you have the right to leave. Not because you don't love your family but because you're learning to love yourself more. I no longer believe blood is unbreakable. I believe in honesty. I believe in limits. I believe in choice. And I believe that a true family is where you can be yourself, not where you must sacrifice who you are just to belong. So I'll say it again for myself and for anyone else who needs to hear it. You are not wrong for choosing to protect yourself. You are not bad for saying enough. And you are not alone. What about you? After hearing this story, have you ever had a moment in your life that made you stop and ask, what am I holding on to? And what part of myself am I losing because of it? If you've ever been the one silently carrying a whole family without anyone noticing, if you've ever been labeled the ungrateful child, just because you dared to set boundaries, leave your thoughts below. I want to hear your story because every voice shared might be the anchor someone else is searching for. And if you believe that kindness should never be manipulated, if you believe everyone deserves a place to call home, one built on real respect, not just names on a family tree, then don't forget to follow this channel. Because life still holds so many untold stories. Stories about family, about pain, about quiet rebirths. And sometimes one well-timed story is all it takes for someone to start finding their way back to themselves.